the master percussionist pulled me aside and had to teach me how to breathe. He said, "You've been exposed to some really powerful rhythms." He says, "I'm sorry, I didn't even think about it." But those rhythms were so strong that it had my heart rate, my blood pressure up, but it was powerful in that I thought, oh man, rhythm, tone, frequency, vibrations really are powerful. And that's part of the mysteries.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hey rock stars, it's your host Lid Shaw. I created this show to introduce you to real-world recording professionals to hear their stories and learn from their experiences so that you can take your records to the next level and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Neal Cappellino, a multi-Grammy awarded producer and engineer who has called Nashville his home for more than 20 years. In 1992, he built and operated a commercial recording studio for several years and now maintains a private facility, the Doghouse, which is his home base for his work. Neal is a member of NARAS, AES, and Leadership Music 2016, and he also sits on the board of the Melodic Caring Project, a nonprofit company that streams live music events to hospitalized children around the world. With a performance background in keyboards and a bachelor's of science in electrical engineering, Neal has built his career on empathy for both sides of the glass, helping guide platinum artists as well as emerging independent talent. His extensive credits include Alison, Krauss and Union Station, Vince Gill, Joan Osborne, Avicii, the Gabe Dixon Band, Dolly Parton, and Brad Paisley. Please welcome Neal Cappellino to Recording Studio Rockstars. Neal, my friend, are you ready to rock?
I'm ready to rock.
Awesome, dude.
I'm ready.
So can you introduce yourself more in your own words and tell us more about who you are and how you got here?
Well, I guess just short history, brief bio. I came from Rochester, New York, left there to go to school in New England. Like you said, electrical engineering degree at Worcester Polytech. And I worked throughout school in the industry as an engineer and decided I didn't want to go into engineering. I was a lifelong musician and kind of, looking back, I've always been a creative. But in the 80s, electronics and electrical engineering, computers, it was on the forefront. So that was kind of where I thought I should go. I also minored in jazz while I was at school. And while everyone was interviewing for jobs, I was talking with my jazz instructor and who would become kind of a mentor and a confidant, and said, I don't know where to go. I'm not going out into the world of engineering. He said, well, why don't you try talking to my friend Mike, who's the studio manager at Longview Farm? And I did, and that was my first job. So I cut my teeth as an engineer there, and they hired me to see if I could, maybe fix an 1176 or something. But it was a foot in the door, and, that's what it takes is just getting that first opportunity. So
that's cool, man. I didn't know you were from up Northeast too. New England was quite a place to be in the 80s it still is, but it was sort of like the original Silicon Valley alongside Silicon Valley, wasn't it?
Yeah, even in terms of tech.
Yeah, in terms of tech, you had New England Digital, and wasn't Lexicon from up there? And
yep, Lexicon and, the conventional industries as well, Raytheon and things like that. But yeah, and just New England's a great place to be. It's proximity to everything, whether it's mountains or oceans, and lots of music happening.
Yeah. MIT's right there in Boston. And I remember, I think a lot of great speaker designs and mic designs are up there. I remember meeting David Blackmer up in near Nashville, New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I worked at the Bose factory for a little while.
Right. I was going to mention Bose. Mm-hmm. And then Longview Farms. That's super cool. Isn't that where Pat Metheny made a lot of records?
He made American Garage there. As far as I know, that's the only record he made there. But the studio's no longer. They closed just a little while ago.
Tell us a little bit about that studio. What was it like?
Well, so Longview Farm was... I guess you could call it a residential studio. It was two different studios built on 30 acres in rural Massachusetts, North Brookfield, Massachusetts, which is west of Worcester. So it's about 2 hours from Boston. Beautiful horses and chickens and dogs. And I lived there a good bit of the years that I worked there. They had 2 rooms, one of which was the farmhouse. It had an MCI 600, either MCI tape machines or Otari 2-inch machines that were so popular in the 80s. And the barn, which became famous for recording the Rolling Stones' Tattoo You, they made the barn studio for the Stones in 81, 82, or remade it. That was a great room. And it was you can imagine a real working barn, like the horses below. But on the second level, they had built a stage that was about 60 feet wide by maybe 30 feet deep. And that became the performance area for the Stones for recording. Of course, there was other rooms and isolation for other things as needed, but they built that sound stage for the Rolling Stones, and that became a real hallmark of Studio B in the barn at Longview.
Were you there at that time, or did you appear sort of right after that stuff?
I came to Longview in 86, so the Stones had long gone, but lots of great music there. Stuff, Jay Giles, Stevie Wonder, a bunch of people parked there and that was still the kind of the modus operandi for making records, is to camp out at that point. And that was kind of like the last great era of that, where you had a cook. John was the cook, and you'd wake to great meals, and you'd break in the middle of the night for great meals, and you'd work long hours, and you'd wear it out. But it was really on another level, it was really, you were pretty well taken care of there.
That's cool, man. It's funny because I was not far away in 86. I was in Groton, Massachusetts, right down the street from you.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Finishing up my high school. So I wasn't ready for recording yet, but I had picked up a guitar and learned 3 chords at that point.
You had your sights set.
Little did I know it. And tell us more. Who is John? Is he the owner of Longview?
No, the owner was Gil Markle, who's since passed. John was the cook, and Jeff was the groundskeeper, and Nibby was the night watchman. Zeke was a day watchman. Jesse Henderson, I'm still in touch with, was the chief engineer when I got there. There was another, Libby cared for the horses. There was a whole staff there.
Wow.
So it was kind of like the Longview family. And Bill Ryan, who's still up in the Boston area doing studio tech stuff. He did a lot for that studio, technically.
That's cool. Yeah. It sort of paints this picture. I picture this all happening over in England on some, manse somewhere.
Would be. That would be the New England version of it.
Well, that's cool. All right. So you were at Longview. How long were you there for?
It was about 2 years, 86 through 87. Then I moved to Boston.
Nice. 2 years with no sleep, and then you moved to Boston. Tell us sort of your path from Boston to Nashville.
Well, Boston was pretty cool and pretty wild at that point. Since Longview Farm, I have been pretty much nothing but a freelance independent engineer. And that was the case in Boston. I worked at various studios, a lot at a place called Pyramid Sound in South End near the train tracks. That was a wild ride there. The owner was less than stable, but I gained a lot of experience there, and experience in many facets of the industry, whether it's audio or psychology or fighting for your money.
Yeah.
So there was a brief stint there where you're threading it together. I did live sound. I played keyboards in bands. I worked at the studio, and it's all about meeting people and kind of pollinating. So that was then. And at that, I guess I lived in Boston till 91. Decided to travel around the country for a while with a girlfriend at the time. So we packed up a van and actually spent a few months in Seattle. And then we left from Seattle in a VW van and toured the country for a year. That was great.
I was actually doing the same thing. I was backpacking around Europe in 91. So I'm seeing these parallel paths.
You're stalking me. Yeah, that's cool. I guess the wanderlust hits us all, and that was a good time to do it. Just really cool to see the country. Take the time when you don't have as many, obligations and contracts in your life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, so when did you come to Nashville?
Well, I first came through Nashville on that trip in 91. Then I came back to stay in early 92.
Cool. Again, that's exactly when I moved to Nashville. I came down here to go to MTSU at that time. So,
wild.
I wonder if we crossed paths then and didn't even know it. But of course, you were way ahead of me. You had already been in studios and been working. I was just showing up to learn all this stuff for the first time.
Yeah, but here we are.
Well, cool, man. Well, so now I like to always ask my guests to sort of launch us with an inspirational quote on the podcast. Do you have something you'd like to get us started with?
Well, it's funny. I'll give you a couple. For a long time, I had a piece of console tape across my console in the studio that I built that said, "Be bold and mighty forces will come to your aid." I have that on the website, and there's some contention over the authorship of that quote, but there's a guy from Germany who saw that quote on my website and decided that he wanted to work with me. So he took it to heart. There's another one that my father always says, son, you go where you're looking. I think about that every day. And then the last one that might be apropos for our times is a good friend of mine has a quote that he says, "Now would be a good time to wake up."
Nice. I like all three of those. They're great.
There you go.
I like that, man. Be bold and mighty. I mean, I think that is a great credo just for making music and mixing and playing a note on an instrument. Singing a note. I remember my choir teacher when I was a kid growing up, she used to say they'd much rather hear us sing the wrong note loudly than never, than always sing wimpy.
That's right. That's right. Give it heart.
Give it heart. It's you got more rock and roll and if you put something into it, for sure.
Well, and who says, now I forget who it was, but maybe it was Miles about somebody. He said the note is only 20% of it. The rest is heart.
Nice, man. I haven't heard that one yet. I like that. I remember there was another quote. It's not exactly the same thing. I think it was Dizzy or somebody who said, whatever note I land on, if it's the wrong note, I'm only a half step away from the right note.
Yeah.
So maybe that's part of the same idea. Just land, leap and land with conviction, because if you're only a half step away, you can always sort of straighten yourself out.
I like it.
How about sharing with us an important story about a failure for you, something in your career or maybe with your studio when you came to Nashville or maybe even before that, where things kind of fell apart, but it turned out to be a real learning experience for you? Everybody
has fails. There's a lot of fails. It's the best learning mechanism we have. But when I came here, I built a studio over in the Big Red Building by the Cannery, and it was like a 2,000 square foot loft space, and it was very much the indie studio. And this is 94, 95, 96, all the way up to 2000, I think, is when I closed it. But part of the decision to close it was from one of those fails where I had, you're always trying to get the next level of clientele in there and talking it up and selling it. And so one day I did get one of those sessions, and it happened to be a demo session for, I can't remember the artist, but I had never worked on the Nashville system of 10 o'clock downbeat. It was unknown to me.
Right.
I didn't assist for any engineers when I came here that were working in mainstream Music Row type business. So I was just kind of an indie studio, and they're like, "Hey, this is cool, vibey. Let's come in and do it." And by 10:01, I was being undressed for not being in record. And I'm wearing all the hats. I'm making the coffee. I'm wiring up the session,
setting up the mics at 9:59.
Yeah. Hopefully not, but addressing any of their requests or changes. And no sooner did we did get going shortly after that, but shortly after we got going, a jackhammer started outside the window.
That's because the train tracks are right back there too. I remember that.
Yeah.
You get some beastly trains going by the cannery building.
You do. And as much as we tried to get some well-timed train noises on recordings, it always evaded us. I don't know.
You're not the first person to say that. Roger Mutno once told me, because his studio is right behind train tracks, he said that somehow the train never made it onto a recording.
Same here. In 6 years, it never did.
It's like too musical.
Maybe there's some agreement there.
But back to the jackhammer.
The jackhammer, yeah. So the jackhammer starts. I mean, it was a complete meltdown. It was, there was enough tension in their crew, artist and demo producer or whatever, before they even walked in. I figured out afterwards. But it was, the session crashed and burned. Of course, the artist needs somebody to blame it on, and that was going to be me in the studio. And so she went stomping out, claiming that she'll never work here, and she's going to tell everybody what a piece of crap this place is. And,
wow.
What can you do?
I don't know. I thought about that because as a studio owner, we have this responsibility to, I guess, if we want to take responsibility for it, we have the responsibility to prepare for the unexpected. And what do we do when the unexpected happens? Moments before you and I had this interview, which we're using Skype for, the power just went, just kaplunk and just shut off completely. And I was like, oh, no. So I went storming out into the street to go see if anybody was working on the lines and, kind of let them know, hey, guys, could you turn my power back on? And it came back on. But I mean, this is the kind of stuff that does keep you up at night sometimes when you're the studio owner, is what happens if something comes along and it just destroys the session,
Yeah.
What was your takeaway from all that?
Well, just to finish the story, I did send, I sent my wife, Lene, down. She says, do you want me to go talk to him? I said, probably better you than me at this point. So she went down, and talked to the construction crew and says, hey, we have a business up here and this is disturbing our recording session. And I didn't know this at the time, but they were obligated to stop whatever activity they were doing if it was interfering with a commercial business.
Interesting.
And so we did get things back online thanks to her. But the session continued. It just blew the vibe. It blew everything that was tenuous to begin with. And so you just let it go. I let it go. And, you're building a business. It's a gut punch at the time. You think, oh gosh, this is terrible. There's so many people in that group of people that I wanted to impress. And when that goes bad, it's never a good feeling walking away from that. But
well, sure. And you fully understand, I'm sure, the value of investment or the level of investment that everybody else has even put into just being there for that day. All the musicians, the artists, the schedules, everything. I mean, we appreciate that as studio owners. I know that sometimes, when small things happen, I find the easy fix is, offering to comp the extra time or an hour or whatever, or just reset the clock, and that helps people out. But it is what a drag when it just completely derails the session and everybody's grumpy for the rest of the time.
Yeah, I did. I felt bad for them. They got something done, but they didn't get done what they needed to. But in hindsight, and I think I recognized this after, that was part of the writing on the wall with that particular space. And that's what woke me up. And I said, I'm not going to be able to take my business as far as I want it to go in this space. And from that point on, any more investment in that space to me was going to be wasted effort. And so that was a big part of the reason why I decided to close that studio. Fascinating.
And that was a lease agreement? It was a commercial studio. You were leasing a space, something like that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I was doing all the leasehold improvements out of my pocket. Actually, the owner was paying for materials because I was doing real improvements to the space, but it was all my labor. And we did a lot. We did a lot to that place. And we had a very amenable situation worked out. But it just became too difficult to actually run a business. It could be it was a great indie studio for people that didn't mind putting up with the chafe that was parking or noises or, not great HVAC system or whatever. I pretty much knew I wanted to go further than that.
A couple of things that's fascinating to me because I find that recording studios often have unparalleled requirements for operating. We often need a place that is that needs to be quiet. I know that when I studied or listened to some field recorders talk about going and capturing nature sounds in the world, they pointed out that the entire Earth, it's nearly impossible to locate a place where you don't have background noise of man-made sounds. Even in remote jungles, you have planes that fly overhead and things like that. And so, you amplify that into an urban environment and you realize just what kind of challenges a recording studio can be up against to try and create this perfectly isolated and quiet space. It's quite a lot.
Yeah, it is. I guess we're looking for a bubble, acoustically, electrically, temperature, environment, that sort of thing. We need, obviously, instruments go nuts in, changing temperature and humidity. So there's all that as well.
Well, so if you don't mind, I want to stay on that topic for just a sec because I think it's fascinating and I'd love to learn from you, and I'm sure our listeners, who I like to refer to as the rock stars on our show, would love to learn more about this too. What are some of the typical challenges that people are faced with when they say, I want to start a commercial recording studio?
Well, first and foremost today is, I think, a contracting marketplace. I think you're looking at a landscape that has gone through a thorough disruption via technology and the democratization of what we do. So I would have to say, the challenge is coming up with a viable business plan in this marketplace now. Mm-hmm. I look at what we do as engineers and producers as, I feel like I'm here by waging the war of attrition. And I think that there's a definite solid middle class of people that are professionals in this industry that are disappearing, be they people or studios. Mm-hmm. So I would say to anybody who wants to put a commercial recording studio together, run the numbers. Or unless, you happen to be not exposed or susceptible to financial realities of running a studio. I mean, if you can just do it and you have money and it's a hobby, great. I mean, I think the creativity is important. The music is wonderful. But the recording studio business is a tough road to hoe right now. And I think it will be for some time.
Yeah. Well, let's say hypothetically you're in a place where you can just choose to create you've worked in some home studios in the past. You described even Longview Farms as kind of a home. I don't know how it was, whether it was commercial or it was sort of residential and just out in the middle of nowhere. But let's just say hypothetically, in a place where somebody can choose, should I start a home studio or should I start a commercial studio? Because I know I want to do this for the next 10 years, 20 years, or build a career out of it. What are some of the reasons that people are most likely to want to start a commercial studio?
Well, I would think either, number one, I would say, I used to go through this exercise with even equipment purchases. A reason to start a studio is because you've got the work and your situation is dictating it. You just can't accommodate it, in the home or in the way that you've been accommodating it. And you find a limitation there. And so,
like you've outgrown your home studio, for example.
Yeah. For instance, either, now you have trouble tracking at that studio, or you have acoustic challenges, whatever it is. Maybe you're sharing the home with somebody. Maybe you've gotten married, whatever. Yeah. And it just won't fly to have microphones and cords strewn through the kitchen.
Sure.
So I always use the exercise of the first time that I recognize the need for a different situation, you make a note of it. The second time you recognize that need, you start putting a plan in place. And the third time that you recognize that need should be the last time. You should have the next thing formulated. And so whether that's, I need a microphone, I need it once. Okay, well, needing it once isn't enough to go out and make the purchase. The next time I need it, okay, that validated the first time, and I'm going to start putting funds aside. And the next time that you need it, you should either have it, or you should say, that's the last time I'm going to do without that.
Nice, I like it. That runs a little bit different from what I remember Daniel Lenoir saying, because my internship was at Woodland Studios, and he was showing up to do Emmylou Harris's record, Wrecking Ball, and his assistant came down with a truckload of gear to load up the studio. And I remember hearing him say, Daniel doesn't like to rent stuff. He'd rather just buy it if he's gonna use it. But maybe that was a different situation too. Maybe those were different considerations for the budget.
Well, yeah, I think there's a different financial situation driving that. If you can afford to have it, have it. If those are tools in the toolkit, that's great. When you're just starting a studio and making your way from a 57 to the next step up, you have to choose wisely. So those are a little bit different.
Yeah, sorry, you could almost say when you're climbing the ladder from a 57 to a 47.
Yeah, there you go. That's pretty much it.
Well, cool, man. Yeah. I feel like I've been leaping in with some comments, but I appreciate you talking about the commercial studio stuff, because we never really talk about that much on the show. And I think it's such a great thing to understand. Well, let me spin it back on home studio for a sec. What are some of the things that can happen in home studios now that could never happen 20 years ago, 10 years ago?
Everything, really. Everything can happen. Tracking is a little bit harder. There was, the pendulum swings and then it comes back into the middle ground again. And not too long ago, the pendulum swung way to the side of home studio and home recording and home everything. People came back towards the middle when they realized that maybe things weren't sounding quite as good as they wanted to. I know I got a lot of tracks to mix, and people saying, I want it to sound like this. And I'd say, well, it doesn't sound like that right now. So, you start that process in the recording. And so I think the pendulum has come back, but by and large, myself included, people have rooms in the home where you can do some of the heavy lifting of mixing, for instance, or all of the mixing, overdubs, certainly things like vocals, editing. Guitars, editing. Editing is that extra step that was invented with
home
the
studios, right?
with home studio and the advent of digital.
Probably home studios too, because all of a sudden people had a lot of time on their hands.
True. Yeah. So the absence of that, clock on the wall ticking away the hourly charges at a commercial studio is liberating. And I think that's great. So pretty much everything just depends on your particular home or your particular space.
Well, so Neal, let me jump back onto track here with us on the podcast and ask you to share with us a story of a real success moment for you in your career.
I loved going back and listening to some of the stuff I did years ago and hearing how unaware I was at some point, or how unself-conscious the recordings were when I didn't, actually when we were on tape. A lot of the 2-inch 16 recordings that I've done on tape, when I go back and hear, like when I just didn't know anything and we were really just capturing, I think those are just as valid success and moments for me that are validating as the stuff where you get awards for. I mean, all my work with Alison Krauss has been remarkably rewarding, and that's on a daily basis because as demanding as it is, I learn so much, and I learn so much from the creatives that I work with. I love learning about the technical, and I'm always trying to be better. But I also think that there's tons of people in this town, in this world, that can do what I do technically and do it better, and they do. But there's something about just learning how creative people function and how they listen, what matters to them. I just like the musical moments where it just kind of lifts off. And I find that mostly in working with people. That doesn't happen in an editing situation. that happens, with people on instruments. I just did a great record for a guy named Jeff White. It's a bluegrass record, and we did it all in Vince Gill's home studio. There you go. And he's got quite a nice home studio, as you would imagine. But the musicianship, the level of musicianship, and this was Jerry Douglas and Barry Bales and Ronnie McCurry and Dan Tominski and Becca Bramlett sang some, and just Vince played a bunch, and it was just through the roof, the level of inspired playing. It just, it can sound hokey, but those are the times when I feel like it's a success. I'm glad to be there. And the other part of it is just having a balanced life. I know this isn't really to your question, but
I love balanced life.
Balanced life has to be part of it because, this is not the only thing in the world that's happening. And music is important, but at the same time, you have to take care of yourself. And so if I can, and your people, your family, kids, whatever, if I can do that, if I can provide, and if I can be healthy and present for all the other aspects of life, then it's working. But as you know, you can get all the accolades and awards, and if your life is a mess, it's hard to enjoy it.
Absolutely. I mean, I know you're a parent, and I'm a parent as well. I always say that my daughter is the best record I ever made. And, I love making music, and I love being, particularly like you described, being with other people. I've done this enough now to realize that while I do really enjoy some of my alone time in the studio, it's peaceful. The thing that really motivates me to want to make records is being able to spend a day with people that I really like, all creating.
Yeah.
It's a great feeling. It feels like a good reason to be alive and a good reason to do what I do. But the balance of that too is that I know that I hit a threshold. I mean, I adopted the 10 to 6 schedule years ago as part of, having a family and just sort of needing to find balance in my life and my schedule. And I love it. When 6 o'clock rolls around, I find that it's great for us to wrap up the day. And I love to go for a run or go to the gym or go get some exercise, take a break, work on other stuff. And then the next day I'm just ready to rock again. I'm much more productive if I work a series of 8-hour days than if I try to compact them all into one. Now, that said, it's also nice, the flip side of that balance is every once in a while, sure, I love to burn the midnight oil too.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to put a clock on creativity, as you know. I think as a general rule, that's a very healthy thing to do. And that's actually one of the challenges, of having a home studio. If you do any work at home, it's kind of always there looming. And it really takes some discipline to install those boundaries and be away from it, even though it's right in the other room.
Yeah. Especially living in, 2016 with a phone staring at you and beeping emails at you and messages all day. I mean, where computers and our music become so intricately tied together with the computer that it's just always calling you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, right on, man. So, how about telling us some of the stuff? Well, actually, before we move on, you mentioned doing the record with Alison Krauss, and I'd love to just geek out on that for a sec. I've worked with Victor, and he's just such a fantastically creative guy. I know that Alison and Victor Krauss both, they come from a very musical family. What was it like working with Alison? Can we talk about how you recorded some of that stuff? Some of the, let's geek out, some of the mic choices, the methods for recording that kind of talent.
Well, I have to give props to Mike Shipley, who's no longer with us, because Mike was the primary recordist on that and mixed Paper Airplane, which is what we got awards for. But I spent a long time with that record with them, almost 2 years. And that was predominantly Alison and I in the studio doing instruments and vocals. So they tracked as a band, and a lot of that is captured live, but especially with that album being a little bit more conceptual than previous records, there was more to do with instruments and a lot to do with vocals. And so I've been lucky to be working with Al. I've worked with Alison in some capacity since maybe 2002, 2000. And so we were pretty much camped out. Either we started out at Blackbird and then moved over here to the Doghouse for a while doing instruments and vocals. And I can tell you, if you want to geek out on tech stuff, her signal path at that point, which it's changed now, was a Sony C800G microphone. Mm-hmm. And I was going through a Neve preamp into a CL1B. That changed for some of the background vocals, depending on who and what the song was. Guitars, I'm pretty much using nickel diaphragm KM54s or KM56s. Just recently started using SE Electronics RN17s, which are transformered small diaphragm condensers that work great on stringed instruments.
Now, would you describe these as kind of very flat measurement microphones? Or would you describe these as mics that have more character and more of an EQ curve going on?
Well, it's not the 84, it's the KM54, and then the KM56 is a multi-pattern version of that. And those are small diaphragm tube microphones.
Okay. Actually, maybe I have used the 54.
Yeah, the Neumann. And those are, I couldn't dictate the EQ curve or what it's like. It's got a slight rise at 6K.
I do think of that mic as having attitude, though.
Yeah, it has a personality, and it's something that is very complementary to stringed instruments. And the challenge there is balancing mid-range, and especially in bluegrass with so many mid-range instruments and vocals being in the mid-range, and it's all kind of mid-range management. So if you find a microphone that is friendly to the mid-range without getting crass or harsh, so those microphones, and then the RN17s are, a really affordable version. You can get a great stereo pair. And then, let's see, what else did we do? Dobro. Gosh, we had a number of different things on Dobro. M49, sometimes a Sheps. I have to pull back. This is 2010.
Well, so M49, I'm thinking now large diaphragm, right?
Yeah, that's a large diaphragm tube.
And is that typical that maybe a dobro you need a little more body? You need to address the body more with a larger diaphragm?
Yeah, obviously it depends on proximity, but there's, the sound hole on a dobro projects a lot of the bottom end, and then the extra resonator, you get a lot of the mid-range tone. So it's usually 2 mics on a dobro, and you can balance bottom and top.
Okay, so sorry, say again, where would you put the 2 mics on a dobro?
So you put one on the lower side of the resonator, or this is what I do anyways, pointing at the resonator where you're getting a lot of the honk from the dobro. And then the other one you would put over the sound hole, the round sound hole, just above that, some distance away, maybe a foot or more away from that. And that, like an acoustic guitar, the low end, that 200 that comes out of an acoustic guitar, there's a low end that comes out of that sound hole for the dobro too. So you can balance that mid-range honk of the resonator with the body and the bottom end coming out of the sound hole.
And would you sometimes pan those out and make it sort of a wider stereo, or would you tend to pan them on top of each other?
Definitely, if you have your phase coherence, and a lot of that is what the distance is from each of those microphones to where the pick is meeting the string. And of course that changes. But in general, if you have a good phase coherence, then that'll collapse to mono better. And you can spread it out and have it take up more of the stereo picture. It just depends on what's going on in the song and how you need to localize the instrument.
Interesting. Do you ever get tricky with acoustic instruments like this, using some of these modern phase plugins to try and phase align multiple mics on a dobro or an acoustic or any other instrument?
Yeah, sure. I've tried that. And the funny thing that I found is when you look at it on the screen and try and do it visually, it doesn't correlate to what sounds best. And so, like with a bass DI and a bass microphone, there's always going to be a slight offset in the time where the bass DI is ahead. That can work, but by and large, I try not to look at it because it doesn't always correspond to what sounds the best. And sometimes a little bit of phase cancellation between 2 mics or something actually can carve out a little bit of boxiness.
Oh, no, wait a minute. No, that's not true, man. That never worked for a Fender Stratocaster. No, I'm joking. So Rockstars, what I'm referring to, of course, is that you've got multiple single coil pickups, and one of the tricks of many electric guitars is putting those coils out of phase with each other, where you get that kind of hollowed out, thin Strat sound.
That's right. So the analogy to that would be the microphone slightly out of phase a little bit, not 180 degrees, obviously, but
time alignment wise. So interesting, because a lot of acoustic instruments do often have pickups in them. And when I'm doing the Bonnaroo hay bale studio, for example, I always say yes to a pickup from the instruments out there, just so that I've got that and I've got the mic. And if the mic is picking up too much of everything else in the space, I'll favor the pickup a little bit and get a little more definition. But what are some of your favorite ways to time align the pickup to the mics with instruments?
So, I have a lot of the UA plugins, and they have one of those little labs, phase adjust, IBP, I think it's called. And I'll use that. Sometimes I'll just shift the track on the Pro Tools edit window and see where it kind of clicks into a more solid image. And of course I do, I say don't look at it, but of course you look at it and see if I'll pick a transient and say, how far am I off? I mean, I can help it by getting it in the ballpark visually, but then ultimately you just have to listen to it. So yeah, those things, just turn the knob and see, because it'll change according to the frequency that you're listening to as well. So if there's a little bit of smear, that's where I hear it, is in the top end where it smears or it's not quite focused. If there's a little bit of bottom end that's missing, a lot of times you can compensate for that with EQ, but it's kind of the integrity of the imaging, which is the articulation. And if that's kind of smeared, those are the things that make us do other things like add top end EQ, which might not be the solution. So maybe it's just, pulling one mic down and saying, oh, okay, that's a lot more solid articulation or image than with the other 2 microphones in. And Maybe it's just adjusting the levels and not having them all equal level, just finding where the basis of your tone is with one mic and then have the others more in support.
That's cool, man. I've never heard anybody describe the importance of phase as being all about that articulation before. In fact, I would have expected it to be a description of the opposite end, which was just like you're just trying to get the low end in focus. And it's probably because mostly I'm phase aligning drums or bass guitar or something like that. A reminder, rock stars, you have to carefully adjust the levels of the two things you're phase aligning to, because if one's too loud or too soft, it really masks the other and it can fool you into not thinking you're not hearing it.
True.
All right. Well, great tips on recording that stuff. I appreciate that. I guess what I wanted to ask about Alison's voice, for those of us who are familiar with her records, would you describe it as smooth sounding as we're used to hearing it in recordings? Does she just have she's got this laser beam angelic tone to her voice.
Yes. Like any voice, she has to be in the right place with her voice in order for her to commit it to tape. But I will say this, usually we're focused on the last very few percentages of like what is clear, what is good enough. So for most people, like you said, her voice is pure and angelic and wonderful, but then it's always a little bit different when you get into the studio and you're listening to playback, and the things that she's listening for in terms of her vocal tone is it clear and is it smooth? Is the top end open? Physically is the voice in good shape? And that has to do with a lot of things. Are you tired? Are you well rested? Are you dry? Is it, what's going on emotionally? All those things play in. How does your voice sound? So she is unyielding, in terms of getting that last bit, 5 or 2%, to the point where her voice is, she thinks, the best it can be for recording. And
fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And she's, I wish more people would be aware of their instrument that way and wait for it. I mean, she has the luxury. It's not always a luxury. It's sometimes very inconvenient and difficult for her to say, no, not today. But she does, because I think she respects the importance of it. And it's not, she's not a diva about it. She just cares about, music and giving the best that she can.
So now let's talk about your experience, because as the engineer or producer on a session like that, when do you feel, or do you experience the same thing that I experience and that other people do, where sometimes you're just feeling like, I'm just a little tired and I'm not so sure what I think about this, or this sounds pretty great. How do you manage some of that where you try and really hold on to your perspective and feel confident about the accuracy of what you're suggesting? Do you ever suggest that the vocals are sounding right or wrong, or do you just sort of wait for the artist to suggest that themselves?
Well, man, that's a great question. Yeah, I definitely do sometimes question the accuracy or veracity or what I'm being asked. Sometimes you're being asked for one thing and it's not, there's a kind of, sometimes somebody's just looking for encouragement. So it might be, does this suck? Does it sound any good? And your answer is, you kind of have to get, that's where the relationship comes into play. But yes, I do. I try as much as possible to be really on my game. I have to have a lyric sheet in front of me. The technical details have to be taken care of so I can use my right brain. I can't look at the music. I can't look at the screen. And that's why the lyric sheet is so important, because it gives me something else to look at. I can make notes on the sheet. And another thing that's important is if somebody wants to come in and listen after having done 4 or 5 passes, try and play the right pass back, the best take that you think they did, or play a section where you think that they really were on. That would be flattering to them, because what you're trying to do is demonstrate the yes and not as much say the no.
Interesting. Yeah, that's great advice.
Yeah.
It seems kind of obvious, but it does take extra effort. I mean, you have to be taking notes. You have to have a lyric sheet and you have to have written down which was the best section of which take so that you know exactly which one. And I assume you have somebody sitting next to you who's operating Pro Tools at that point. So you have to be able to tell them which one to play back.
Not with Alison. She doesn't want anybody else in there.
Oh, okay, cool. Talk about that. Talk about the importance of the vibe in the control room when people are singing and when the artists are playing.
Well, with her, it's either just me and producer or just me, and that's the way she prefers it. And she prefers to sing in visual sight, because I think it's important for her to be singing for somebody. She doesn't want to sing into a baffle or a wall. She wants to be singing for people, and I think that's interesting. And I think also a vocalist just needs the liberty to go through their process, whatever it is. You don't have to worry. You don't want to worry about, am I showing somebody my ass in the wrong way? And that just puts you in the wrong self-conscious mode.
Yeah.
When you have to kind of get out of that mode.
You got any good tips for kicking people out of the control room?
Yeah, I mean, just
get the fuck out.
You there. Sometimes I have had to excuse my assistants and just, I said, look, you just got to be a little bit thick-skinned about this. This is this artist. They don't prefer anyone else. It's not personal. I'll call you when we're done, or come back tomorrow, or whatever. And one time I did have to excuse the producer. I was asked to excuse the producer.
Wow.
And so you just, I think I just said, I think this would go faster and easier. I forget what I said.
If my intern takes you out to lunch right now.
This is this might be a real idiosyncrasy, but I think they're having some trouble getting comfortable because, they want to impress you. And I think it's important that they don't need to impress you right now. It's that sort of thing. And just try and think of a straightforward but nice way to say it.
Well, great, man. Great. I appreciate it. I like hearing stories like that. It's good stuff.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, so now, Neal, let me jump forward here. How are you doing on time? Are you good?
I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, great. Fellas, let's remember to edit that little comment out. So Neal, tell us more about the Melodic Caring Project. I think that sounded pretty fascinating. Would you like to talk about that at all?
Oh, sure. Levi Ware up in Seattle and his wife, Stephanie. Levi was a client and then a friend, and then he's an artist, and just kind of finding his way in music, and one day happened to be asked to perform for a young girl who was in the hospital with cancer. And he did so via Skype session on his laptop. And I think it affected him profoundly. And it was a cathartic moment for him. He's like, this is what music is for me in my life. And they formed the company and asked if I would be an advisor or a board member for them. So of course I said yes. It's been a slow, tough go for them. Nonprofits have a hard time, obviously, raising money and getting awareness, but they're doing great work. And the format for them is tying into touring artists' live venues. Like they take a 2-mix off the board. They have a really well done 3-camera produced shoot. The artists agree to address the children that are joining the live stream feed. They also coincidentally call their kids rock stars, because they are the real rock stars of the show.
Yeah.
And so the artists know to address these children by name in whatever state or country they happen to be in. And they designate or dedicate a portion of the show to them. And I think even as far as one artist brought the cameras backstage into the green room and just kind of brought the kids out of the doldrums of their hospital room and the physical challenges that they have into this virtual world of a concert that's being personalized for them. And it goes so far, not only just the healing element of music, but the idea that this is something that they get to look forward to for a few weeks, and really, really emotional stories from both the children and their parents about what these concerts do for them, give them hope and strength and more determination to get through their chemotherapy or surgeries or what have you.
Yeah.
So it's just one of the ways to give back. I applaud Levi and Stephanie for what they do, because it's not easy, but it's very gratifying.
That's beautiful and powerful, and what a great reason to make music.
Absolutely. The best reason.
Well, very cool. Well, let's see. I think we're going to take a break here in a moment and come back for the jam session. But before we do, let me throw a few more geeky questions at you too.
Okay.
And talk about stuff that you might want to talk about. I've got a few here. I would ask you about drums, vocals, or guitars. I feel like we've talked about vocals and guitars a little bit. Would you like to talk about some secrets for mixing great drum sounds? Well, let's start with mixing. Maybe we'll go to recording after that, but you have had the experience of receiving tracks that were not quite all that, and you really had to pull some tricks out to try and excite the drums a little more. Can you talk about that and give us some good tips?
Sure. Yeah. When the first thing I do is just pull up the faders and listen and start I throw a trim plug-in on every channel of the drums and start messing with phase. We talked about phase. So this is 180-degree phase flip on any of the instruments or any of the drums.
And rock stars, and if you're not familiar with phase yet, that's the circle with a line through it. Just click that button and see how your drums sound from mic to mic.
Yep, there you go. And what I do is I tend to check, first kick against overheads, snare top or bottom against overheads, toms against overheads. And sometimes I find that, if I'm flipping all those things, maybe I'll just go ahead and flip the overheads and everything else comes into focus. Making sure that, the floor tom is something that people sometimes have to dig out the low end and get it real present. And sometimes that's a phase thing. But then with songs, or actually with drums, as with songs, I try and find the place where those faders live so that the drum kit is a balanced full picture. Mm-hmm. More often than not, I do drummer's perspective on the left-right orientation.
I do that too. Why do you think that is?
I think it's something like vicarious.
Yeah. Did you play drums a little bit in your life too?
A lot.
I think that's what it is. I think if we've played drums at all, we just like the idea of a drum kit in front of us. I do. Yeah. So then, mixing for me, mixing drums is something that's very song dependent. But, if it's just like a straight ahead rock thing and you want to get them really smacking, then it's usually individual channels treated with EQ and some compression, maybe modestly, depending on how they were recorded, obviously. And then pretty much there's always a parallel channel of compression. Mm-hmm. And I do that through a pre-fade send on each of the individual tracks. What I'll do is I'll find that balance with the individual tracks with the main faders, bust to a stereo drum sub, and then I'll assign a pre-fade send to a compression track. One of my favorites is the 33609. It's a great drum compressor. Now, do we have a plugin for that as well?
UA makes a great one. And I think Empirical Labs is just coming out with something called the Arouser, which is the distressor plugin.
Yeah, I think I saw that at Summer NAMM just last week.
Yep. So that'll be a great one too. And then there's a command, I think it's Command Shift H, which is copy to send, which will copy your fader levels and pans, and I think any of a number of 5 parameters from your main fader and pan. It'll copy those settings to the send. In
Pro Tools, maybe Pro Tools HD, but yeah, it's a
Pro Tools HD. That's right. You're right. It's only HD. So that will send the individual or discrete instruments to what I call the spank track, or the compression, the parallel compression. And then it's some of them I mute. Like I don't want to send the overheads to parallel compression, or it's a matter of adjusting the recipe, how much parallel compression versus, the original track, and how, then obviously you have a stereo sub of the original drums, and then you have a stereo sub of the spank, and then you're adjusting those two stereo faders to taste. Something that's cool about the Arouser and a lot of plugins now is that they have a mix knob. So you can do parallel compression without setting up a pre-fade send. You can just put your compressor right on the stereo sub, dial in the mix.
So one thing to point out, Rockstars, is the difference between having 2 different faders and using the blend knob is if you use the blend knob, you can blend between uncompressed and compressed, but only the exact same balance of drum faders. Whereas if you set up a separate fader, like you said, Neal, you can send, you could send less of the overheads and cymbal mics to that stereo compression if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point.
And that can be helpful sometimes.
Yeah.
So quick question for you, spank. The only other person I know that I first heard that term was Tom Lord-Alge down working with him in Miami. And I know he's also a New Englander because he was up there in Blue Jay around the same time you were.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if that was, you think that was spank was maybe a New England term that was getting thrown around and kind of carried its way to Miami and Nashville?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say you got it from me, but I doubt it. I think it just has the right attitude.
I think I'm going to write a book one day called The Origin of Spank, and I'm going to like do this,
Be careful.
Etymological study to find out where it came from. Yeah, be careful. All right, groovy. How about stereo mix bus? Anything you'd like to talk about? Some stuff that you find often to be helpful as far as what you do about the stereo bus?
Yeah, I like to pick compressors based on their character for the stereo mix bus. So if it's something that's a little bit more mellow and toned down, like an acoustic or a bluegrass thing, I love the Manley Very that has a tone, a color. It tends to be a little more clear. Sometimes it could add, depending on your settings, it'll have a little bit of a lift in the top end, actually. The 33609, the SSL G384, those are great rock or just, a little tougher sounding compression.
And are these all outboard compressors, or do we have plug-in equivalents for most of these?
Well, I've used both, and now I'm doing so much in the box that I'm using the plug-in equivalents.
Cool.
So it's I think because I've used all of those hardware units prior to there ever being plugins available, I feel like I know what to reach for that character or color or tone that I want.
One of the benefits, or let me back up. One of the classic dialogues is plug-in versus hardware, plug-in versus hardware, plug-in versus hardware, right? And that's sort of like an old discussion. And the conclusion seems to be plug-in because it's convenient for all of us to work. But one of the things that I don't think we talk about much, but is a real outcome and benefit of it, and it's demonstrated right here, is the fact that in the world of plugins, and that same plugin being available to somebody all the way across the world in, Southeast Asia or something like that, who might be listening to this podcast, I think it's very cool that we can use a tool here, talk about it, and somebody can have that tool available to them somewhere else. Whereas, a Neve 33609, an original one, wouldn't have been available to most of the people listening. True.
Yeah, it's one of the neat things of our industry now with technology. And, the whole hardware versus software, I was just up at Sweetwater Gear Fest, and one of the demonstrations that we did was I brought an 1176 and a distressor, and what else did we have? We had a couple of maybe CL1B that we compared, and I'd set these sessions up where I had the, gains were equivalent and settings were matched to demonstrate the difference between software and hardware. And, especially in that setting, you'd be hard pressed to pick one over the other. I think where that argument becomes more appropriate is not necessarily on a one channel basis. I think where it becomes more determining is over the scope of many channels, and so you're doing multiple tracks of math in the digital domain versus multiple tracks of math in the analog domain. But there are realities to our industry and our workflow now that we have to accommodate. And I think we're beyond the point of saying this is a compromise. I think if you're skilled and you know what you want out of the tracks and the tones, and you can get the desired results.
Well, I think about the situations, the real world situations where I'm choosing a compressor, for example, or I'm choosing something in the studio. And often the minutia of questions like, should I use a plugin? Should I use the outboard gear? Should I A/B compare things? They're so tiny compared to the musical decisions I'm making when I'm in that moment and mixing and trying to be creative, that's where that stuff ends up not mattering so much,
Yeah. You definitely don't want to agonize over that to the point where you miss it. you miss the performance.
Let me just ask you this one question before we take a break and come back for the jam session. Tell us, what is one of your favorite parts about making records?
Well, let's see. I mean, in the end, it's feeling like you're doing something that number one, it's fun. People are fun. The communion is fun. I think it's the idea that you relate to somebody through this other language, and that you can have these moments where you all have agreement on something visceral. It just kind of like, it's the mystery of music. And I think I have an equal amount of fun as a patron as I do a creator, go into a show and just being floored by what a good show or a good song or a good performance or a good solo can do. So to me, it's kind of, there's still mystery. There's still things that are unexplained in life. And part of that is the effect of music. And that thing where you can be sitting in a room with a bunch of people and all be in agreement on what's good or bad. And what's that based on? It's based on this intangible thing. It's based on a feeling. And, I guess it runs the gamut of emotions. It could be fun. It could be sad. It could be exciting. You could be jacked. And I just remember being involved in a mix of an African drum piece that was like 8 minutes long. And I couldn't believe, after 3 days of working on this, I thought I was going to have a heart attack after 3 days. And the drummer, the master percussionist, pulled me aside and had to teach me how to breathe. He said, "You've been exposed to some really powerful rhythms." He says, I'm sorry, I didn't even think about it. But those rhythms were so strong that it had my heart rate and my blood pressure up. And it was a real good, it was a weird experience, but it was powerful in that I thought, oh man, music really, rhythm, tone, frequency, vibrations really are powerful in this world, and that's part of the mystery. So that's, to me, what gets me jacked about making music.
That's wild, man. What a great story. I love hearing that. I was going to ask you if you had the experience of making music across languages with people from other countries, and clearly you have. And it also reminds me, one of my previous guests is Ian Brennan, and he talked about the power of music and some of the methods of teaching, where a master percussionist would sometimes literally beat the rhythm into somebody's back for days at a time until it becomes ingrained in your body. And that sounds like what you just described.
Yeah, very much so. This percussionist, when he was studying in Africa, he said all they did was learn to breathe for weeks before they even touched the drum.
Wow.
And then here I was being exposed to this powerful mother rhythm, and it got inside me.
That's cool, man. That's cool. Well, what a great place to take a break, and we'll come back here in a minute for the jam session. Rockstars, before I go, just a reminder, as I always like to do, you'll find the show notes to everything we're talking about on the website and the blog post at rsrockstars.com or recordingstudiorockstars.com, and then just use the magnifying glass and search for Neal Cappellino, Cappellino, 2 P's, 2 L's, right?
That's right.
All right, good deal. I wanted to make sure I got that right.
Yeah, thanks.
And also, if you're listening on your phone, you can just click on the iTunes podcast app, if you're on iTunes, for example, and it'll pull up. You'll see the show notes right there. So you can just, with your finger, click through on the link, and it'll take you right to the show notes. And we'll have links to stuff we're talking about, links to Neal's records, and anything else Neal would like us to link to. But meanwhile, we'll take a break, and we'll come back in a moment for the jam session. Hey everybody, it's Lid Shaw, and I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of Recording Studio Rockstars. I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate your time. And as a way of saying thank you, I've created a special mix tutorial just for you, Rockstars, totally free, called the Mix Master Bundle. With it, you get over 2 hours of detailed videos watching over my shoulder as I mix a song in my studio. Plus, I give you the free ebook that explains how I recorded the tracks. And you get downloadable multitracks so that you can practice your mixes, including the Pro Tools session file, using nothing but stock plugins in Pro Tools, all of which you would find in any other DAW, whether you're on Logic or Studio One or Reaper. Maybe you're struggling with trying to improve your mix technique, or maybe you just simply don't have access to multitrack files or can't record a full drum set in your studio. I wanted to give you a chance to create your own mixes from full drum kit, bass, and guitars recorded in my studio. The song is called American Winter, and it's off my instrumental record Skadoosh, and it's all available for you totally free right now. All you need to do to get it is text Mix Master Bundle to 33444, and I'll send it directly to your email. Again, that's Mix Master Bundle with no space to 33444, or you can go directly to mixmasterbundle.com, enter your email, and I'll send all the files directly to you. Thanks so much, Rockstars. We'll see you guys in the jam session. Cheers. Welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm here with my guest, Neal Cappellino, and we are about to jump into the jam session. Neal, are you ready to jam?
I'm ready to jam.
Awesome, dude. When you were starting out in recording, what was one of the things that was holding you back from moving forward as quickly as you might have liked?
Probably having a mentor. I think I skipped that step. I think a lot of my learning came kind of hard won, learned my own lessons through my own mistakes sort of thing. Whereas the traditional path, especially in this town, is to work at a studio or for an engineer and get as an assistant or an intern. And I did none of that. I just came to town and I started building a studio. And I probably would have learned a lot quicker if I had had a mentor or somebody to learn from. I did eventually learn from folks, but it was a little bit later on.
That's good advice. So find somebody that you can learn from when you're starting out so you can kind of accelerate that process.
Yeah, and it depends on your trajectory or what your goals are as an engineer. I mean, I wanted to be in the commercial marketplace. Some people just want to be able to record their own music or be a hobbyist. But if you do want to be in the marketplace, I kind of miss the apprentice journeyman phases of things, of vocations. I think that's real important.
Well, I know you've had experience teaching and doing some mentoring as well, but what are some of the things that you find most people need to learn initially? I don't know, that might be too vague of a question, but when you've done teaching, what are some common things that people often start out needing help with?
I think people need help in being patient. I think, everybody wants the silver bullet, and it just doesn't work that way. I mean, I could tell you what I do, but you're going to have to do that and a dozen other ways too, and find out what works.
Now, do you literally mean Bob Seger and his band?
Yeah, I hope not. But yeah, that's the thing. Everybody wants to know, what do you do for mixing? What do you do for this? It's helpful to understand that. It was helpful for me to watch masters do what they do. When I tried to do what they do, it didn't work out the same way. And I remember one of the first times I worked in a great studio, I think it was actually Ocean Way A, I had everything available to me, and much of it I had no idea what it sounded like. And it was a real difficult session because I was using gear that I didn't know the voice or character of that gear or that microphone. I thought, you know what, this is a lot more work. There's a lot of work to do to get to know these tools. I knew what a 57 did and a 421 and maybe a 414, but I didn't know what an M49 sounded like. So yeah, I think, just spending the time doing your own thing and learn. Don't be afraid to incorporate other people's tips and tricks, but ultimately it's got to be, your own distillation process.
So how about some of the best advice you remember receiving when you were starting this out?
Well, Richard Dodd told me, I remember wanting to help him or not help him. I wanted to learn from Richard. And I said, can I work some sessions with you? He says, you can learn from me, but I can't teach you.
Interesting.
I took that to mean, and I think correctly, that he's not going to stop his workflow to show me anything. And it was up to me to know how to learn in that situation and to glean what I needed to glean. And that was before YouTube and lynda.com and that sort of thing, and this sort of thing. The imparting knowledge through interviews and stuff like that. It was just be there and be useful and learn, pick things up, take notes, take mental notes. So that was, I think, insightful. And for him, it's like, yeah, I don't have time to do this. If you're useful to me, you can be here.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the producers I really like to work with, we were discussing interns and what to do in the studio. And he made a comment once. He's just sort of like pointed out that, like, if you're interning on a session and you don't have something really helpful to contribute, then why are you here? You're just taking up space.
Yeah.
In a place that space is clearly limited. And obviously you just described a vocal session. Space is just non-existent. You're not even allowed to be in the control room.
That's right.
So get yourself some X-ray 3D glasses and learn through the walls.
Well, in this chemistry, that's, I think, an overlooked component, an element in the recording situation is chemistry. I don't care who you are or who you're with. There's a chemistry part. And, when I'm talking to interns or assistants, I'd say you need to be chemically neutral. That means verbally neutral and most often quiet. That means physically neutral. I had an admin intern, and she used to wear really, really heavy perfumes, and I had to talk to her about that. everything. It's the things that you just wouldn't normally think about.
Yeah,
But
it's true. I've had, sometimes interns, it's tricky because you're asking them to do a lot of stuff, putting mics away and things, and you just got to be well showered.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Here's another silly, ridiculous little detail, but it's very true. When you're younger and, you're interning and maybe you don't have a lot of money for usual stuff, maybe you're sort of shortchanging your laundry a little bit too. And that's an important thing. You got to make sure that you're showing up at the studio in clean clothes every day, and that you make sure you put enough quarters in the dryer so that they don't have that kind of mildewy smell to them. So there's a geeky thing for me to say, but it's true.
Yeah, point taken.
So how about sharing with us a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce? I know you've done lots already, but throw another one at us.
I'll throw a couple at you. Everybody loves compression, and compression is one of the most kind of mystical. It's like, wow, compression can do so much. I find when I get tracks that have been over compressed, it's largely due to maybe a low end frequency or a low frequency energy that triggers compression to happen before it would really be necessary. And so one of the hacks that we were sharing up at GearFest last week was inserting high pass filters before you compress. And I was telling you before off camera or whatever about people that want to shadow sessions and learn mix tips and stuff like that. And one of the things that I do to clear up a mix is to get rid of all the unwanted low end stuff, and that's high pass filters are your best friends on a bunch of stuff, and especially if you're going to be compressing. Filter out all that unwanted low frequency energy that could trigger a threshold and get gain reduction happening before it's necessary, or just too much gain reduction.
Mm-hmm.
And mess with the slope and the frequency so that you're not losing the low tone that you need, but you're eliminating anything from plosives to microphone stand rumble to low frequency bleed, all those things that can really muddy a mix, especially because when you're mixing, you're going to apply some amount of compression and limiting. It's just going to bring that low frequency noise floor up too, and that's how you end up fighting clarity in your mixes, is all bringing up all this low frequency, really non-essential information.
I know that ultimately we have to use our ears and make judgment calls based on how it sounds, but before you even listen, what are some numbers you would throw at somebody as suggested starting points for a low-cut filter for some different instruments?
Well, on a vocal, maybe on a male vocal, I might start at 50 or 60 at a pretty steep slope, high-pass filter, and then see how it affects the tone. Mm-hmm. See what you can make up in a low-frequency bump that's higher than your knee frequency, and get the body back, but you can still cut out the low stuff.
Okay.
Like electric guitars and bass, there's a point at which the bass, tapers off and the guitars pick up, in that low mid frequency. So, you just have to kind of play with that.
That might depend on the key of the song and the tone of the bass and all that. Exactly.
There's acoustic guitars, there's a lot of woof that comes out at 200, and that might be more of a notch than it is a high pass filter. But sometimes, depending on what you want to do with acoustic guitars, I'd run that high pass up past 120, 130, maybe up to 200 if you want a nice kind of, more articulation and string and pick thing than you do a body of the, especially if it's like a double tracked acoustic guitar and you want to pan them out wide and have it be like the Tom Petty thing,
mm-hmm.
Mike Campbell. Mm-hmm. Play with that, because then you can compress a little bit more and you're not pulling up all that woof and rumble that comes out. Same thing with a snare. If you kick and snare, you want to filter out a little bit of the kick drum so that it's not triggering the snare compression. Snare gets some real good, like I think of those deep Al Green snares, from Royal Studios. It's like 180, 200. Maybe you can set your high pass somewhere around 80, take some of the kick drum bleed.
Yeah.
So you can, it's just playing with it.
And would you typically, if you were sitting down to do something like that, if you don't hear the kick drum bleeding into the snare mic, does that mean you don't have to worry about it?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So you just still trust your ears. If you're hearing something then you filter it and you should be able to hear that difference. I guess if you're on small speakers, it can be harder to hear that difference, and maybe you can just set something down there as a safety.
And I use an automated high pass filter as well on vocals to deal with plosive.
Oh, interesting. Right. So you're bringing it up and rolling off much higher when there's a letter P, a letter P.
Yeah, P or B, and stuff like that. Yeah. So maybe it's fixed at 60, and then if there's a plosive, I'll automate the frequency to go up as high as maybe 200 to pull it out.
What about background vocals? Do you find that a lot of times BVs can be rolled off much higher to not try and compete for the low end space that the lead vocal is sharing?
As a general rule, sure, and always to taste and according to the song. Sometimes the background vocals may occupy a more prominent, maybe it's more of a duet or something. But yeah, if you have stacked vocals or a background vocal group. So the low frequency, a lot of times our ear interprets low frequency as, distance in terms of the soundstage, the depth. So the more low frequency content, the more we perceive it as being closer. The less low frequency, the more we perceive it as being back in the soundstage. So you can play with that too. It's
like proximity equals closeness.
Exactly.
Well, let me say that differently. Proximity equals proximity.
Right.
Okay, cool. So now how about sharing with us a favorite hardware tool for the studio? And let me sort of put this in perspective. Something physical that when you go to sessions, you're sort of always glad you've got it around. And it doesn't have to be, the 1176 or something obvious. It could be anything at all.
Well, I'll just make a shameless plug for these reflection filters I've been using that help out quite a bit. A reflection filter is this kind of U-shaped baffle that has a sound absorption material on the inside, and you place it around the microphone, and it does two things. It helps you isolate the microphone from bleed, or it helps to kind of tune the space that you're in. So if you're in a really reflective room and you don't want that much reflection getting into the microphone, the reflection filter can knock down those reflections and help you control the acoustic space a little bit. Electric guitars, kick drums, a lot of times I use a piece of foam that I'll stick on a snare mic to try and block some of the hi-hat from coming into the snare mic, because that's a very typical thing. Trying to get top end and crack out of a snare, you're always going to pull in the hi-hat. So when I'm recording drums, if the drummer will accommodate it, I try and put a little bit of a foam barrier between the snare mic and where the hi-hat's coming from.
Let me throw in a comment on that. I'm wondering if, like some other things in the studio, there are many times where you don't notice a problem when it's being created. You only notice it later on when you're mixing or mastering, or you're really amplifying something or brightening something or really bringing the presence forward in the mix. Do you find that when you're doing things like putting the piece of foam on the snare mic to block out the hi-hat, do you ever sort of over-exaggerate what you might do with the snare so you can really hear what it's doing to block the hi-hat out? Or is it you just sort of get the drum sound and then you just, if you're hearing a little too much hi-hat, you put it in there and it takes care of it? How do you approach that?
Well, I just kind of do it as a general rule, as long as it's not adversely affecting the performance, and I know that's not going to hurt me. So what you're talking about, exaggerating, kind of looking downstream a little bit more and saying, let me apply a lot of compression and top end to the snare mic and see how much this will be a problem if I don't do this. Yeah, you can do that if you have the time to do it and decide whether or not you need it. The foam is pretty innocuous as long as it's not getting in the way of the sticks.
Well, I guess Rockstars, what I'm suggesting is that might be something for you to experiment with to understand, or to better understand, why you might want to block the hi-hat out from the snare mic. If it's not obvious to you now, maybe try cranking the compression up on the snare or brightening the snare a lot, and all of a sudden notice when you mute the snare mic, you're like, whoa, my hi-hat's coming and going from my entire mix. I didn't realize it was that much hi-hat in the snare drum mic.
Right. Good point.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So now what about and thanks for bearing with my extended explanation there, Neal. What about a favorite software tool in the studio? Something you really enjoy having around?
Well, I love having the ability to bring up a big template of reverb and delay effects. And one of the things that I've been using a lot is this Thermionic Culture Vulture plugin to give tracks grit. Vocals, B3, sometimes, if a guitar is a little too tame and you don't want to really reamp it, That's a cool tool. I do a lot with sending kind of circular sends to delays and reverbs, and sending instruments to or vocals to a delay, and then sending that delay pre-fader to a verb, and kind of cross-pollinating the effects. That's always fun to me, is creating different dimensions with delays and reverbs. And usually, one of the things I like doing with verbs is taking a lot of top end off of the verb and having a very long tail, automating the send or the return of that to give one or two phrases in a song just this long tail to it. It doesn't have to be applied, statically. It's just something that happens once or twice. And those are kind of the cool things that I always loved about records, is that ear candy that you look forward to hearing every time you hear a song or something.
You talk about Tattoo You. They've got in Start Me Up, Bob, I think, mixed that first snare hit, just kaboomed it right into a reverb before the song kicks off.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff is cool.
That sort of thing, for sure.
Now, when you're setting up effects on a mix session, is there, generally speaking, do you find that there are certain effects that are shared all across the instruments in the session? Do you find that, no, that's not the case? Usually I have these couple of effects that are really just for the drum zone, and these couple of effects that are only for the lead vocal. And is there sort of an approach to it that might help people understand how to navigate their effects a little better?
Well, yeah, and that changes a little bit. I do try and share effects as much as possible. Like you want the effect to be an extension of the tone of the instrument. And I audition a number of effects. I'll pull up 20 tracks of effects just to find the right one, and just keep sending, a guitar or a vocal through all these different effects and see which ones feels right just kind of naturally, and play with the presets and then modify stuff. And then I see how many other instruments can share that, because what you're trying to do is kind of create a single picture that's glued together. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. It depends on the instrument. In acoustic music especially, you're going to find that a mandolin won't respond to reverb, or reverbs won't respond to mandolin the same way they will to vocals. It's very specific, and you either end up EQing the send to a reverb, or EQing the return, or sometimes compressing the return. And I use sends to these reverbs instead of doing a mono instantiation or a mono aux track where you instantiate a stereo reverb, which means you get a mono in, stereo out. Mm-hmm. I instantiate a stereo reverb on a stereo aux so that it accepts panning information too. A lot of times on my reverb sends on instruments and stuff, I'll do send pan follows main pan. My send to like a 140 plate, the stereo, and if I have it panned off to the left, then the send is panned off to the left as well, and the reverb return responds to that. So it localizes or positions the reverb return for that instrument too. Sometimes it's helpful. Sometimes it's okay if they're just all coming back in a wide stereo spread.
Interesting. So it's the send going to the effect lets you choose whether it's pan to the left or pan to the right. Does an actual EMT 140 plate have stereo inputs and stereo outputs on it, or is it sort of the classic mono input and then stereo outputs?
I've seen versions of both. The one that's here has actually has a Marker Tech amplifier to it that has stereo in and out, but we have it set up as mono in, stereo out right now.
Fascinating. Cool stuff, man. Thanks for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
How about a resource for the business side of doing it? If you want to do this and make a career out of it, you got to figure out how to survive for the next however many decades. Got any tips, whether it's people, attitudes, or software or tools we need?
Quicken is helpful. Keep track of your expenses just so you know real world what it costs, where your money's going. There's nothing more helpful than looking. For me, I'm a numbers guy. I like looking at the numbers. And you can get a really good picture of what you're doing by looking at what you've paid and what you've been paid, and then what that sorts out to at the end of the year or the quarter or month or whatever. That's really helpful. And then I would pay somebody to help you do your taxes at least a couple of times so you can see how to navigate that. It's hard being self-employed. You got to pay self-employment taxes. I would do it above the board, 100%. You don't want to get caught owing back taxes. Mm-hmm. You just want to sleep at night knowing that you're not going to be vulnerable somewhere down the line for something like that. But and then admin rights on, if you're a creator, you have authorship, or if you're doing production and there's royalties involved, the admin stuff is really cumbersome, but it's worth getting your hands around, whether it's copywriting songs or registering with Sound Exchange or a performance rights organization. Do all that stuff, and when time comes, hopefully you're seeing revenue from it. But it also helps you in your dealings with clients if you ever get into that. Not many people know that if you're registering stuff with Sound Exchange, musicians actually share a portion of the digital royalties from Sound Exchange if you register it right, if you do all the data entry correctly.
Interesting. So I think one of the things I grappled with understanding all that originally was this idea that you would really get into the admin because you were hoping for some sort of big win, and then if you thought, I'm not really anticipate a big win, I'm not going to worry about it. But I think maybe you would agree with this, and maybe other people would too, that really it's like that diligence to taking care of your admin is so that you, like growing a garden over so many years and decades, you carefully collect all the little stuff. And then one day you look back and you realize that you've completely survived as a result of collecting all the little things that come along.
It could make a difference. Yeah. I mean, it could. I mean, I can see how people are easily daunted by that, or just sometimes it's easy to say, nah, man, I'm just interested in the music. It's all good. I'm just putting it online anyways. But I think it behooves you to set it up as if something could come of it. And it's just another way that you would be valuable to anybody else that's looking for that resource too. If you start doing production, then it'd be nice to have that part of your game taken care of.
Good stuff, man. Well, now here's a bit of a hypothetical question. Then we're wrapping up here. But imagine you needed to start over again, and you were moving to a new city like Nashville. Today, if you only had a few $1,000s to spend or whatever, and you needed a setup to record with, you needed to find people to make music and record with, and you needed to pay your bills in the meantime while you sort of launched your career, what would you do, or what advice would you have to somebody who's starting out now and needs to just get going from the ground up?
I would probably outfit myself with the limited resources with some kind of portable multi-channel recording situation that I could move around with, whether that's going to other people's spaces or maybe going to live venues, seeing shows. If I was younger and putting more energy into going out a lot, that's probably what I would do. There's been some great success stories with people attaching themselves to artists for the love of the music that they make, and then ended up working on projects together, and that being the launching pad. So I'd probably put money into a computer-based, a laptop-based multi-channel recording setup, an interface, some affordable pre's. Antelope Audio makes the 32-channel pre and like 2-rack space. That's really great. That's the Orion. So the Orion is the 32-channel interface, and then they have a 32 MP, which is 32 mic pre's in a 2-rack space. Nice. And it's kind of like their ecosystem. So, I mean, that you could go to a club, you can go to somebody's home studio or whatever, find the things that are ubiquitous, that are versatile. One of the most versatile microphones is obviously the 57, the 421, the RE20, the Audio-Technica 4033. When that came out, I loved it. You could use it on everything. So those sort of purchases, and there's a million different flavors of that now, but those sort of purchases will go a long way towards, accommodating many different scenarios.
And what advice do you have for somebody who needs to make ends meet initially?
Multitask, I guess, you're going to probably be in the position of supporting this career endeavor at first. So it'll take a lot more than it'll give back. I think it's got to be, it's got to be tough today because schools are churning out in more and more certified, quote unquote, audio engineers. And so it's a really dense field, densely populated field. So I would say you're going to be supporting the endeavor for a little while anyways. And maybe if I would support that with, not to be old school, but just a job, hopefully maybe in a parallel field. Maybe you're in video production, or maybe you're working at a club, but being there, so many people have said being there is half the deal, showing up.
I always find that whatever job you choose, pick one that allows you to be available for a session at a moment's notice.
Yeah. When I first moved here, I didn't have a job. I think I worked for a courier service and I did landscaping, and it was nothing, I have a bachelor's in electrical engineering, but I didn't want to get a job at a company because I knew that it would eliminate the possibility of being available.
You could have gone and worked at a console manufacturing, for example, like Harrison is right here in Nashville, right? Did you consider those options as well?
No, I didn't.
All right, then. I love it. All right, groovy, man. Well, here comes the last doozy of a question, and I have to thank you at the outset so much, and from all the rock stars for giving us so much time today. Really, man,
sure,
magnificent of you, and I owe you big time. I'll take you out. We'll go get some lunch soon, hopefully.
Sounds good.
Tell us, what is the single most important thing that our listeners can do to be a rock star of the recording studio themselves?
I think it's be the right person. Hang in there. And like I said, there's a lot of people that can do what I do and do it better, but there's only one person that can be myself, and so a lot of what you bring to a situation is who you are. Personality, chemistry, your heart, your work ethic, your intention, all that stuff factors in. It's the intangibles that add to the picture at the end of the day. So I think that we harp on that a little bit, but I think it's an important thing.
Absolutely true.
Yeah. That's what I would say.
Well, groovy. Neal, thank you so much for being here on the show with us on Recording Studio Rockstars. You are a rock star, and we love hearing all this advice that you shared with us and all these great insights and tips. Tell our listeners how they can find you, learn more about you. If they want to hire you for their next $1 million recording project, how do they do that? Whatever you'd like them to know as far as connecting with you.
Yeah, it's all available at nealcappellino.com. I get emails through there, and I answer them pretty regularly. So that's the best way.
Okay, groovy. And Rockstars, NealCappellino. Thank you again, man. Really appreciate it.
Great. My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
All right, man. Well, I look forward to seeing you around the studio, and I owe you big time. So thank you.
I'll take you up on that.
All right. Cheers.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.